I think that's really what I'm trying to do through making this work, is just trying to say, like, here's where I am and where we sort of all are on this continuum of time and space and history. And, our lives matter. Our lives are important.
Hello, print friends, and welcome to the 71st episode of Pine Copper Lime, the internet's #1 printmaking podcast. I'm your host, Miranda Metcalf. I release weekly podcasts with people in the print world who are doing something a bit beyond the expected. So please subscribe on your podcast listening app of choice. You can also find Pine Copper Lime on Instagram and Facebook, and you can sign up for our monthly newsletter with print news from around the world, all at pinecopperlime.com. We also have a Patreon page, on which supporters toss $1 or $2 in our tip hat every month, and they help keep PCL bringing you hot printmaking content. You can also get neato thank yous like stickers and totes, and if that sounds like something you'd like to know more about, check out the link in the show notes. It's also totally okay if you don't want to know more about that, because times are weird, and if you just want to listen to the show and enjoy, do it. Print friends, I am very excited to tell you that Pine Copper Lime, 2 years in, finally has merchandise. We have stickers and totes and shirts and baby onesies for the little budding printmaker in your life. We have some with the PCL logo, of course, but there's also various other kind of inside print jokes. So if you want to confuse your friends and family with a shirt that reads Albrecht, Kate, Francisco, and Jose, you can find those on TeePublic. Just check out the link in the show notes. Printmaking forever, shun the non-believers. Pine Copper Lime is brought to you by Speedball Art Products, who've been bringing you a diverse range of high-quality products to your creative practice since 1997. Products like their fabric block printing ink. They've seen this line adopted by even the most dedicated traditional oil ink-based lovers, especially when people are printing on merch or printing at live open-air markets and public events. So if you're dreaming about that first post-COVID market, this is a great product to check out to get started. To find out more, or to learn where you can pick up a can of your new favorite ink, visit speedballart.com. Just check that link in the show notes. My guest this week is Stephanie Santana. Stephanie is a Brooklyn-based printmaker, fabric artist, and archivist. We'll talk about her finding art through MySpace, taking up printmaking through an illustration gig, historical textile traditions carrying religious and ancestral meaning, and creating archives with old family photos, as well as how becoming a mother has affected her practice. So, without further ado, sit back, relax, and prepare to flip through the old family photo albums with Stephanie Santana. Hi, Stephanie. How's it going?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for joining me from that early morning in Brooklyn. I've been really enjoying kind of setting up these calls with people where it's like morning for them and evening for me, because I don't know, I think there's just something sort of special about that time when people are kind of beginning or ending their day, and I'm glad we could work it out and that we get a chance to talk about you and your practice and probably a bit of the insanity of 2020, I'm sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a pretty calm, quiet morning here, so I'm excited to talk and chat.
Excellent. Well, before we kind of dive into talking specifically about your practice, would you mind just giving a little bit of an introduction and letting people know who you are and where you are, although we already said Brooklyn, how would you describe what it is that you do?
So my name is Stephanie Santana. I'm based in Brooklyn, and I'm a textile artist, surface designer, and printmaker. And I mostly work with screen print, and lately I've been printing a lot of family photographs onto fabric and layering that with other techniques like embroidery and painting, and just working with that a lot before getting into quilting a finished piece.
As we said, you're in New York now, but
Mm-hmm.
where did you grow up, and what role did art play in that part of your life?
So yeah, I grew up in the Seattle area, which I know you're familiar with from your work with Davidson Galleries.
Yeah.
Yeah, so my growing up, my favorite thing was writing and illustrating my own stories. And I did all kinds of craft projects, like making those pot holders that you weave and paint by number, and so on. And we visit the Seattle Art Museum a lot. So I was aware of art, and I was really aware of artists like Jacob Lawrence and Faith Ringgold. Tar Beach was one of my favorite books as a kid, and it still is to this day. So I feel like I was introduced to art early on and had a lot of exposure to it, but it wasn't something that I thought about as seriously in terms of a career or developing a practice until later in life. But I just had a lot of fun with it as a kid.
So how did that shift sort of end up happening for you, where you went from just having that kid-like experience of getting to do a little bit of this and a little bit of that to realizing this is something that you were really going to dedicate a big part of your life to?
It's an interesting story because I really didn't do a lot of art making seriously throughout much of my teens or my early 20s even, I would say. I think when I really started getting back into it was when I was in school. I was studying communications, and I had a telemarketing job. So it was a lot of just like, I mean, it wasn't traditional telemarketing, but it was more fundraising. So we would call alumni and say, hey, this is Stephanie from Western Washington University. And we'd kind of ask them for donations. And so I just started kind of doodling, which I always have done. I had a calculus class when I was in high school where the teacher was like, I don't know if you're really picking up on this calculus, but you take beautiful notes. I mean, that was a weird memory from high school. But so I started doodling on paper and just drawing things again, and like posting my work on MySpace, because I had a MySpace profile at the time, which is actually how I ended up meeting my husband, is through MySpace.
Oh my
and
gosh.
He actually was one of the main people that encouraged me to get back into making art more seriously. And this was years ago. This was, I think I was 20, 21 or so, because it was always something that had been something that I enjoyed doing, but it just wasn't in the forefront because I was kind of taught to believe like, oh, you need to have a more serious job. So I don't know. That was just my family in particular.
Yeah.
So I went from that to, as I moved out here. So I moved out here to Brooklyn in 2007. And that was a time where, there was a lot. I mean, there's always a lot happening in terms of art in New York, but just that exposure to people making art just on on a smaller scale here in New York, like in the Brooklyn scene. And just my husband's family is very, they're a family of artists. So just, that was just sort of this really important time for me to really dive into all of that. And I started really enjoying working with patterns. So to backtrack a little bit, in 2011, 2012, I worked on a film called An Oversimplification of Her Beauty, which was directed by Terrence Nance, who also did Random Acts of Flyness on HBO. I don't know if you've heard of that.
Yeah, that I have heard of.
So he was looking for people to do illustrations and animations, and he asked me to do animation, and I was like, I'm not really an animator, but I can do illustrations. So I did a series of illustrations in Photoshop and just layered a lot of patterns. And so he ended up animating that. But I really realized through that experience and through some of the work that I was doing on my own, just doing collage work and pattern and textures, that I really enjoyed textiles and pattern and color. So I started taking workshops at Textile Art Center, which is now where I'm based at the studio here. And they're just incredible. They have amazing instructors who are really knowledgeable. So I was studying things like natural dyeing from Natalie Stopka, who she does a lot of really beautiful marbling, and she's a bookbinding artist. I started studying block printing. And from that, a few years later, I moved into studying textile and surface design at the Fashion Institute of Technology here in New York. And that was just a really beautiful introduction because we were required to take a few classes on screen printing. So I actually started out And that's how I really came into printmaking, was as a textile designer. So I
Yeah.
started out taking screen printing classes and learning to print and repeat on yardage tables, which obviously is something I still do. And I was really excited about that because it teaches you to really appreciate the labor that goes into making printed fabric. And I'm always interested in learning these foundational techniques because, until recently, screen printing was one of the primary ways that a surface design was applied to fabric.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't start out learning to print on paper. I'm actually more comfortable printing on fabric, even though I do print on paper now. And I edition on paper, but I had a professor at FIT who really challenged me to view screen printing as a medium. And, I think before that, my view of screen printing, I'd taken some screen printing classes here and there, but it was just, I didn't really know there was this whole other range of textures and colors that you could achieve through screen printing. So by working in that lab, I learned to bring more of my hand into the work and work with photographs and the way that we create positives, both by hand and Photoshop. It just allowed me to learn to be a little bit more subtle about the color and texture and be a little bit more experimental with it.
So I had no idea that you came to printmaking through textile, which is really
Mm-hmm.
interesting because I think we mentioned when we were sort of chatting via email before that I feel like I haven't spoken with someone who has textile as a huge part of their practice before, which, this is like 2 years into the podcast, and printmaking and textiles, as you say, are so interconnected until really recently, like you were using traditional printmaking to make these patterns, and then of course in many places in the world they still do it, and then in sort of bespoke clothes they're still doing it as well. So it's interesting to hear, that you came from printing on fabric to printing on paper. Do you see these sort of as like different sides of your practice, or do you kind of see them as interwoven, or how do they kind of interact for you?
I would say that I do see them as different because when I print on paper, it's really, creating an edition and creating something that is just, I want it to be as consistent as possible, of course.
Yeah.
So whereas when I print on fabric, I will work with the same image multiple times because there's so much work that goes, because I burn the screens myself, and that is a lot of work, and I've made a lot of mistakes with that,
Mm-hmm.
like emulsion being old and, all kinds of things that, can happen in that process. So it's like once I get a good image on the screen, I want to make sure I utilize that. And so I will print, I don't want to overdo it, but I'll do like 10 images in different colors. And it's really because I'm a textile designer as well. I think in terms of color trials, and I think we all do in terms of art making, but I'll dye a certain piece of fabric green and then I'll print with red on it, or I'll, I'll play around with the color a lot because I do dye my own fabric as well and mix my own inks and all of that. So it just feels more organic to me to work with textiles because I'm really just playing around with like the colors and the forms and just kind of being a little bit more intuitive about it versus on paper. I feel like it's very planned and it's, I'll do a lot of trials, but then once I get
Yeah.
to the finished piece, that's kind of where I'll go with it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. And then the way that, like, once something's on paper, it just sort of seems to make this leap into, like, now it is art. Now it's going to be
Yeah.
editioned, right? Like, it's like this can
Right.
go in a frame and hang on a wall, and it just has, like, a really
Right.
different energetic feel to it, or a place, like a place in society or something like that if it's on paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I love as well. Like I
Yeah.
absolutely love works on paper, but I think with textiles, I've kind of moved into a space where I'm making things that are just sort of unfinished, because with a lot of my pieces now are quilted, and traditionally with quilting, you want to have binding on it, you want to piece it together in this very sort of regimented way, whereas I'm sort of just like, I haven't put binding on a lot of them because I'm like, I like the way that it feels when it's a little bit unfinished and a little frayed, and I'm still trying to experiment and explore and figure out what that means for me. But it's been a lot of fun because I'm getting back into embroidery with those pieces, and I have not done that in maybe 9 years. I think the last time I really did embroidery, I wasn't doing it as part of the quilting practice. It was more just, sort of drawing with thread on pieces of fabric that I had, because I'm always collecting fabric scraps and just, fabric that I can work with.
And so what do you think it was kind of about textile, and particularly like printing with textiles? Because, not every form of textile work really has such a strong printmaking element to it. What do you think it was about that process that kind of pulled you in and that you ended up dedicating your practice to it?
I think I often look to historical textile traditions and the way that cultures throughout history would embellish a piece of cloth or give it a symbolic meaning. For example, the cloths that are adorned with the Dinka symbols that are traditionally found in Ghana. I think just the surface design element of it, you see a lot of block printing in Jaipur in India, which I also went to in 2014 to study block printing and learn about the carving process and all of that. I just think it's really beautiful, and there's so much meaning in those pieces of fabric, because it's not just something that's being worn as decoration. There's a spiritual element to it, and I really feel like that is a part of my practice. Is there's some sort of spiritual element to it, because even though I'm working with photographs for the most part that are from my family archives, and some of them include like my mother and my aunt who are still here with us, but some of them, the body work that I've been working with recently is centered around my aunt Bootsy, who actually passed last year. And so it feels like ancestral work too, and sort of meditating on and healing some of those ancestral things that I'm trying to think through how I want to say this. But I think it's working through just meditating on personal history, but then also collective history. Because I think when I look at some of the photographs, and I think a lot of Black folks would say the same when, you're familiar with Gordon Parks' photographs. Are you?
No.
Oh, okay.
Or not by name anyway. Like maybe if I was to see them,
Yeah, so let me think of another way to say that. So Gordon Parks, I'm familiar with his work just over the years of him being, he works for Life magazine, and I think he was the first Black photographer there. And also he lived in Seattle for a period of time, but he is a photographer who really documented a lot of Black life. I think he really felt his role was to sort of shed light and sort of bring a humanity to photography, and really showing the lives of Black folks in particular. And so when I look at my family photographs, I think a lot about the collective history of Black folks, particularly in this country, and then even globally as part of the African diaspora. So I think a lot of what I'm doing when I'm working with these photographs, they have a personal significance to me, but then also sort of a spiritual and symbolic meaning, because I think, like, for example, the piece that I did recently where it's my Aunt Bootsy and my aunt and my mom sitting together in a living room, and just really showing just the interior lives of Black folks, I think is important to preserve that history. So it feels like I'm creating a document, but just doing it in a different way that sort of combines these different textural elements. So it feels like it's very personal to me.
Yeah, I remember when I was sort of reading up on your practice, you talked about, using photographs to understand memory and imagination, and this idea of like the physical evidence of Black life.
Right.
Yeah, which sounds like a really sort of beautiful way of putting it. And, I guess, what kind of draws you, do you think, to that exploration out of all the things of that sort of like personal history? And you said kind of like connecting to the shared histories as well. But I guess, not to get too kind of like esoteric arty question about that, but, just sort of like what does that kind of like mean to you in terms of like the emotional place that it takes up for you, and why you find it fruitful to explore?
That's a great question. I think it's important to me to lift up Black folks and lift up our narratives and really just show the complexity and just the beauty of our lives. So I think that's what draws me to it. And I feel like I've known so many Black folks and Black women in particular throughout my life who are just natural archivists. So my mother-in-law, for example, she's a photographer, Marilyn Nance, and she's also a archivist. So she has inspired me to really think more deeply about preserving our stories. And there's so many different ways that you can do this. So I think this is just my way of doing it is through textiles, because that's something that I connect with just as, something that I enjoy working with in terms of the material. And yeah, I see myself as part of a lineage, really. And another woman that I have to shout out as well is my great aunt, Mary Matthews. She was a librarian, and I believe was the first credentialed Black librarian in California. She did a lot in LA around trying to preserve Black history. So she collected and really championed a lot of Black artists in LA, like Betty Saar and Elizabeth Catlett. And so I'm really inspired by her legacy, because another thing that she did too as well is that she promoted, at the time it was called Negro History Week. I think back in the 1920s and 1930s, which eventually became Black History Month. But she just always really championed preserving our stories and making it known that, we're here and we've been here and it deserves to be documented. So I think something I think about as well is that we're in this digital age where so many of our photographs and our documents and things like that, it's becoming harder to preserve them, because a lot of these photographs, actually, when I started printing them out and working with them and translating them into screen printing, they were things that were sent to me. They were photos that were sent to me through my family on iMessage a lot of the time.
Oh.
Because it was like, I'm here in New York and my sister and most of my family, my immediate family, are in Seattle, and they'd be going through like old photo albums and they take a picture with their phone and like, hey, look at this, look at this picture of, Aunt Bootsy, or, look at your granddad back in 1932. And I'm like, it's just on my phone. Like, I need to find a better way to preserve this. And I actually found that even if the photo itself is not that great of quality, when it's on my phone, that I could translate it into something that's a little bit more concrete through Photoshop, because that's what I use to translate everything into a printable image. So, these pieces that I make are much larger than the original photographs, but it's also, I feel like by adding color and texture and all that, I'm sort of bringing it to life in a different way. Although I still love the original documents, it just kind of takes it into another phase or another time period for me, where it can hopefully survive a little bit longer.
Absolutely. And I think there's something so significant to the context in which images are seen, as sort of, going through a family photo album that can look like a million family photo albums, and that, people will have one relation to that imagery, but when it's been taken, when it's been changed, when it's been put on fabric, when it's being seen in an art exhibition or even digitally again on an artist's webpage, it's going to change the way people relate to that image. And it kind of becomes, as you said, this archive, this preserved history, this canon of an artist's practice that has a staying power that unfortunately family photographs cannot sometimes, because it's just, people see them more as ephemera or somehow like only important to the people who are in relation to them. But when you see them in another way, then you ask, like, how does this relate to me in a more intimate way, I think. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, because these stories are all of our stories. I mean, so many of us have, family photo albums that are really special moments, but like when you see those, you really think about your own relationships and sort of locating your place in the world. I think that's really what I'm trying to do through making this work, is just trying to say, like, here's where I am and where we sort of all are on this continuum of time and space and history. And, our lives matter. Our lives are important.
And I always think that there's something really significant too when people can write their own histories, rather than having just totally outside influence, sort of come in and say, like, well, this was the history, but when people can say like, no, this is my history. Like I can tell you what this history is. Like it belongs to me. And there's something really powerful about that because, for so long, there was a very few handful of people who are allowed to write histories. And now with the access that the digital age has brought us, there can be several narratives happening at the same time now, because it's not just whatever goes in the one history book that gets printed because they bid the lowest in Texas to print the history books. It's, artists and archivists can write their own histories and document it and share it in a way that's, never happened before in the history of histories. Yeah.
Right.
One of my favorite things that I read on your website, sort of when you were talking about this, is that you said that you believe in the possibilities that textiles and prints hold, being record keepers, as protection, as tactile objects of enduring personal and cultural significance, which was just such a beautiful way of putting that. But it was really interesting that you put the word protection in there. What did you mean by that?
I mean, I think about textiles, all the forms that they take, in quilting, it's protecting you from the cold. It's, covering you. And also, I think to your point about history, it's like, if you can create something that really sort of documents your personal narrative and the collective narrative, that's sort of protecting against disinformation that may be happening in the future, which I know is something we're thinking about a lot these days. So I just feel like it has this spiritual and this protective element to it, both physically and just, in terms of creating something that hopefully will be there for future generations.
And when you were talking about sort of kind of finding your place in the history and in the world sort of through this exploration, and particularly as you're dealing with family histories and family dynamics, how did kind of becoming a mother and having a new generation and, creating kind of your own family unit in that way, did that change the nature of the way you were sort of conceiving of families and family histories to kind of be a part of that passing of knowledge?
Yeah, I think having my son, it really did make me think about, it made me think about life in a different way, just in terms of the biggest realization I had was just like, there's no real blueprint or manual to life, because it's like one day you're just kind of going about your business, and then you have this person that you have to care for and pass on whatever knowledge you have to, and try to guide them toward coming into their own. And that really, it just made me think a lot about the folks in my family who had, the things that they had sacrificed and the way that they really worked to, to stake their claim in the world and make their place in the world, and just wanting him to understand where he comes from, because I really feel like we all have such rich family histories, and he's getting that in a lot of different ways. He spends a lot of time with his grandparents, with his paternal grandparents, also live here in Brooklyn because that's where they're from. And so he's learning all these lessons about, gardening and life, and just, she'll teach him, like my mother-in-law, Marilyn, she'll teach him about math by just saying, okay, we're going to take some seeds, we'll take 3 here and 4 here, and we'll make an equation out of it. And there's just like this really organic way that he's learning about life. And I don't know, I'm sorry, I'm like having a moment, because I'm thinking a lot about what that means during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because I think this may not be the case for everybody, but for us, it's really become a time during this pandemic and everything that's going on to really become even more rooted in family, just because that's our day-to-day now. We haven't been able to see friends as much as we would like, as I'm sure is the case for most folks. And there are other ways to connect. Like my son, he's 5 years old, but he's already, because of remote learning, like he's already using an iPad and like sending text messages, and he's like texting people all day, like, I love you so much. And,
oh my gosh.
Sending videos and voice notes and everything. And it's just, it's this weird duality, because it's like on one hand there's all this technology that he's being exposed to, but then we'll go from that to looking at family photos and me trying to kind of like tell him about his family history. And yeah, I want him to feel like the world is very open and available to him to explore. But it does obviously feel a little bit more closed at this time, because before this happened, like we traveled to Seattle, I think once a year, and we took him to Basel, Switzerland, which is where my brother lives, and his and my sister-in-law are out there, and so he got to kind of see what life was like out there. And we went to the top of the mountain, and he was like learning about trams and all this stuff. So it's been a really big shift to parent during this time, and really see like the changes that have happened in terms of what he's sort of absorbed and exposed to on a day-to-day basis. But to go back to thinking about my work as an artist, I think, yeah, I just want him to have a really good solid foundation of who he is. And I think creating this work is part of that for me.
I think it's a really interesting aspect of what you do that I hadn't really thought of until I was just listening to you talk, is that, your work sort of as around conceiving histories and really creating that narrative for a family. I mean, it has to be so disrupted and also sort of changed by the fact that what is a family and how we define it and the way we interact with it has changed so much in the pandemic. Like, this is the first time in my life that I have gone over a year without hugging my mother and father.
Right.
It's
Same.
like it feels so awful. Like I can't think of any other word for it.
No, I totally understand. I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like in this real sense of loss that is surprising to me how much it affects me, because I think we do have the illusion of being connected. We can call and we can video chat, and we can be close in other ways, but having the physical distance is surprisingly difficult. And just other things too. Like I think you and I are probably, I think, basically the same generation, particularly because if you met your husband on MySpace, like
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah.
Dating myself.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm like, I remember that. I had one of those. Yeah. So,
Yep.
so my parents are in their like late 60s, early 70s, and just really feeling that time slippage, and that wondering how much are they going to change in a year? How much am I going to see
Oh yeah.
that time period in someone's life when they do change quite quickly, I think, or they can. It's very sad, and it's very, I don't know. I think I don't have the words for it yet because it's all so new, I guess.
Yeah. I think that's kind of what, I mean, I really, everything that you just said was like the way that I'm feeling as well, because it's like, while I'm here in New York, I do feel like I'm constantly surrounded. I mean, I'm surrounded by my husband and my son and the family that I've married into, like that. They are my family, but I do miss my family that I grew up with, my sister and my parents. And, like you were saying, your parents are in their late 60s and early 70s. That's where my parents are too, in terms of the stage that they are in life. And I think they're missing, I'm missing the changes that they're going through as well. But also they miss his fifth birthday, my son's fifth birthday. They always would come out here for his birthday every year, and that didn't happen this year. So I think a lot of what we're feeling right now is also just this loss of what could have been, like this loss of possibility, or these things that we had all, like, everybody had plans. We all had things that we were going to do. So it's like, well, how do we navigate that? How do we just say, okay, well, that's things didn't go as planned. So now what are we going to do? Like, how are we going to move forward? Because we have to move forward. We have to continue. Life continues on. So yeah, it's a very difficult time, but at the same time, I've really been trying to find just like the small joys in the day to day, which, for example, it's kind of maybe a little silly, but we went to IKEA last weekend and I found these perler beads, which I was like, oh, these are like, I had forgotten what they were called even because, IKEA has their own name for everything.
Yeah.
I think they called them like Plissa beads or something.
Yeah,
But
like Sven.
I looked,
Yeah.
yeah, I was like, I looked them up and I was like, oh, these are perler beads because they're the little plastic beads that you can make into a design on a pegboard and then melt
Oh,
them together.
right. Oh, I
Yeah,
saw those. I wanted to get them because they're like from our
yeah.
childhood. Yeah.
Yes, you should get them. They're so much fun. So I was sharing that with my son. Like we were making these little designs and I was like, I don't know, my husband was joking. He's like, you really got those for yourself. You didn't get them for
Yeah, yeah.
for our son. But yeah, he enjoyed them too cuz so he's like making cuz one of the pegboards that came with the set is in a heart shape. So he's making all these little hearts and so he'll make them and he's like, "Okay, mom, can you iron these for me?" And I think what we're going to do is mail them to like family and friends. I
Oh,
told him like, "Let me know who you
nice.
want to mail them to." So that's something I've been thinking about is just how can we leave a record of this time just for purposes of history, which I think a lot of folks are thinking about just in terms of writing and creating and I think everyone's sort of just working their way through it in that way, which I think that's what we do, because this is not the first time that difficult times have happened in history and we still have to continue on and create through those times. But I really just take a lot of joy in sharing that with my son. Like I'm kind of like the arts and crafts teacher for him because, it's like we wear all these hats. I mean, all of us do, but,
Yeah.
uh, as a mom, it's like, that's one of the things that I obviously take a lot of joy in and he seems to really enjoy it. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
And that you get to wear like two of your hats at once. You get to be like mom and you get to be archivist too, where you're creating like
Yeah.
physical, like that physical evidence, of this time, which is that this very particular time when you had these hours at home with your family for a certain reason. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I really feel like a lot of folks are just, this is my, I don't know if this is a generational reference, but just people digging in the crates, when someone goes into the record store and they're looking
Yeah.
through the crates. That's what I always say when my sister, she'll send me pictures from, she has boxes and boxes of photos. So I definitely think she's got the archivist bug as well because she's going through and looking at all these photos that she had. I never knew that she had, and same with my mom. She's sending me photos on iMessage that I just have never seen before. And it's amazing because I'm like, I remember these events. I remember these things happening. I didn't know that there was a photo that existed, And I
Yeah.
think, I was talking about my Aunt Bootsy earlier, who I'm creating this body of work around her life. And she just had both her and her husband, because she, I think, was probably the person that put together the photo albums, but her husband was more of the photographer because that was his hobby. He was an engineer, but he also loved to take photos. He had his own dark room in the house. And when we went back to visit Aunt Bootsy, because she lived in the Seattle area back in October of last year, so about a year ago, my family and I were looking through all of her photo albums, and she had photos going back to the 1940s. And I was just like, I'd never seen these. She had all these amazing stories. She was talking about, her old boyfriends and things. Like she had a boyfriend who went by the name of Buttermilk.
Oh my
And
gosh.
I was like, we were just laughing. We're like, wow, Aunt Bootsy, like, you were living the life. Like she used to go to the supper club and just, I think, especially as folks get more advanced in age, like, and I think when I was younger, I didn't really necessarily take the time to learn about, all this history and just who were folks before they became parents. Like, who was my mom before she became a mom, and
Right.
who was on Bootsy before she became on Bootsy. At one point she had a totally different name, because her Bootsy is obviously not her real name. And it's just incredible to kind of have that texture of like seeing your family members or seeing people that in a different light. And I also just really enjoyed those photo albums as well, because she did have photographs from certain moments that I remembered throughout my childhood that I didn't know the photos existed, or I'd seen other photos that we had that maybe like my dad took or somebody else took. But I was like, oh, this is kind of gives me another little piece of information. So there's so much information in these images that I think is, it's just important to take a closer look at.
Yeah, and I think that's what you were saying about the not having that curiosity when you're younger. I definitely identify with that. Is that there's something that's so, at least for me, I guess I should speak from the I, maybe not everyone was this way, but just that's so kind of inherently selfish about being a kid, is that you really think that the world came into existence with you, like, because you just don't know any better. You've got this this entire, you just don't have this long view. Your world is this house that you grew up in, and the few handful of people you interact with regularly, and that's sort of it. And then once you get out in the world and you start to see the expanse of it, and I can imagine particularly like starting your own family, this would happen too. That family curiosity comes back, and you're like, oh, like my mom probably had boyfriends. Like, what? Like before my dad, like that kind of thing.
Right.
And that curiosity is in it almost sort of like a rite of passage. And then when you find out who people are, not in relation to you, sort of before you, it, in a funny way, I think it actually helps you find your place in the world a little bit more, because you're like, okay, like, where do I come from? Like even if before I existed, what was the scene like? And it's such an interesting thing to explore.
Right.
That I think a lot of people are doing. There's a family letter in the Metcalfes that's, I don't know, very many great grandfather of mine, had 19 kids, and there's this this family letter that was started by, I think, like the youngest of those 19, that just before the digital age, was this huge, manuscript that just kind of got sent around to all the descendants of Isaac Stevens Metcalf, and people would add on and say, like, this is the update, this is who died, this is who got married, this is who got divorced, this is who had kids, and this is what they're doing, and that's gotten started up again during the lockdown, of course. So I think it's probably happening, to many families that they're looking towards it.
Yeah, and just going back to these family traditions that yeah, that's amazing.
Do you have you found yourself kind of maybe like within this context or another, like really having like a strong kind of creative reaction to everything that's happened in 2020? Or is it maybe more kind of like a time of reflection and that sort of thing as well?
I think it has mostly been a time of reflection, but I've been thinking a lot about creating an archive of the histories or the stories of Black mothers right now, because I think it's important to speak about and document what and that's what I know, that's who I am, or one of the things that I am as a mom. And I just want to have a record of how this time has affected us, because I think there are a lot of layers with that. It's been said, I unfortunately don't remember who said this, but just that there are multiple pandemics happening for Black folks in particular. I think that could be said for more than just Black folks, but I think with all of the talk about the political uprisings and, the racial injustice that's been going on for, for generations, that I think it's important to just check in and just be like, well, how are we doing? Like, how are we getting by? And, I've done that just with my own friends and like with family members, but I have this feeling that I want to create a larger record. So it's not necessarily related to my textile practice, but it's something that I think is important to do. I guess it is sort of related in terms of documentation, archiving, going back to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And, and kind of like creating a history of a really significant time, not just for the pandemic, of course, but for the fact in 2020, for whatever reason, it just seemed like the rest of the United States was like, oh, wait, are you telling us things have been like bad for a while? Like,
no, that's so true. It's so true, because it does feel like there's this. I mean, people talk about being woke, and it's like, oh, we're waking up to what's happening, but it's like, no, these things have been going on for forever, for generations, and yeah, I do find that kind of interesting that it's sort of news to some people that there's racism and there's all these things still happening. But I mean, the pandemic is exposing it all. So I think we've seen that from the very beginning of it. I mean, it's just exposing all of the economic inequality and everything else, like the problems with our healthcare system. It's just really, yeah, it's heartbreaking, but it's also like, okay, maybe there is some good that can come out of this if we can figure out how to make a shift, if there's like a mass realization that things are not the way that they should be.
Yeah. And, sort of, I want to say like touch wood, that'll happen, but that doesn't even seem like that's good, because like touching wood is for luck, and it's like, no, like it's not luck, it's work. Like people just need to do the work, so like so and documenting this time is going to be, I think, so important for the way like you and probably your family come to understand it, but also as people who didn't live through it come to understand it decades from now. And again, like the voice of the history written by someone in the history, like the history of Black mothers written by a Black mother, has vastly, vastly more significance than if it was written by anyone else. And so this is something that, that you can kind of take on. And I'm really excited to see where that goes, because it sounds like it's going to be really important work, and I'm sure really beautiful work too.
Yeah, I think what this time has made me realize as well is that, everybody has something to contribute. We all have our role to play in this time. And I think this is a good time to figure out what that is, like you're documenting printmaking and documenting people's stories with Pine Copper Lime. And I think, it's a difficult time, but it's also a time where folks can reflect on how they've been impacted and how they're, those that they love have been impacted, and, what's trying to create the way forward, I think, is what I'm really thinking about. How do we each contribute something that can move toward making things better, even just a little bit.
And that having to stop gives us the space and the impetus to do that. Like we're not just riding this wave of momentum where, it's just like, I can't think about that right now, because I have, I've got my, my private French lesson, and then the kids have soccer, and then I'm on the board for, blah, blah, blah. And then I've got this thing due at work, and then, I have to be a wife too, like all of that stuff that hit the pause button. It's like now there's space to think about, wait, what have I actually been doing with my life? Yeah.
But it does feel weird, because on one hand, I feel like the pause button was hit, but then it wasn't.
Yeah, that's true.
Because, I think we're also doing a lot. and we're all working a lot, but it's just in a different way. So,
yeah.
But I think there are more moments of quiet. I do believe that, because like you were saying, there's not this packed schedule that's expected of us as much. In the same way, at least not to be there physically. We may have a lot of Zoom meetings, but it's not like, I have to go here and there, and, which is not actually the case for everybody. But yeah, I think for a lot more people, there's a little bit more time to pause and think about things.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there's definitely people like, for instance, like healthcare workers who have found
Right.
themselves with a lot less time. So, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
it doesn't affect everyone the same way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, as we're kind of coming up to our hour recording mark here, is there anything in particular that you're kind of looking forward to on the horizon, that you're getting excited about? You're talking about your new body of work, and of course, we talked about the election that's happening in a couple weeks as well, which I'm sure is on everyone's mind. But is there just anything else that's in your life that maybe you haven't talked about yet that you just would kind of want people to know about and to keep an eye out for? I know talking about the future right now is kind of strange, but just want to make sure I didn't miss anything.
Yeah, no, thank you for asking. Honestly, I'm just looking forward to. I'm excited about some of the quilts that I'm making.
Yeah.
In that aspect in terms of art, but also just looking forward to some of the simple things like going to the pumpkin patch. Like, yeah. I'm taking my son, and we're going with our friends to the farm on Sunday. I'm looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to being able to travel again.
Yeah.
Whenever that happens, I still am dreaming about being able to travel. Maybe going to Costa Rica or going to Thailand or other places. Those are the things that I still dream about.
Yeah.
During this time.
I have to say, sitting in, 80 degrees in Bangkok, and I'm starting to see the pictures of the pumpkin patches, and like, oh, that gets me right in the homesick bone, just that, especially with my husband being in a Western New York autumn, which is just the most romantic, crisp, like cartoon, like TV, like TV autumn, with like the colors on the trees, and I'm like, well, yeah, that's something else. That's not my experience right now. So, yeah, well, I really, really hope you enjoy all of that, and I look forward very much to seeing you share the quilting that you've done, and maybe even pictures from the pumpkin patch. And before we sign off entirely, can you let people know where they can follow you and find your work and see what you're up to?
You can follow my work on Instagram at Steph M. Santana, and on my website at stephaniesantana.com.
Beautiful. Well, I will put a link in the show notes to both of those. And yeah, thank you so much for sitting down and chatting with me this morning. And I hope we get a chance to connect again and maybe work together again. And come on over to Thailand anytime.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, and enjoy the WTF party.
Thank you. Let's hope it's enjoyable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yes. Thank you so much, Stephanie. Right. I will be in touch.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye. Well, that's our show for this week. Join me again next week when my guests will be the founding members of the Radical Intersectional Printmakers Guild. We'll talk about what they're doing and how they're going about building a new printmaking organization from the ground up with intersectionality and accessibility at its heart. You won't want to miss it. This episode, like all episodes, was written and produced by me, Miranda Metcalf, with editing help from Timothy Pauschak and music by Joshua Weber. I'll see you next week.